Pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to show you some facts on the ground as I see them, very much from an economics and business lens. I'm going to then draw out two implications for Special Operations Forces. Frankly, if at the end of this time together of this panel, if you all in the audience ask questions a little bit differently than you do right now, I think we'll chalk it up as a success. I am a professor at the University of Notre Dame. You all definitely do not need an economics lecture. So instead, I'm going to start with a story. It's 2009. I'm in southern Lebanon. Besides being a professor, I'm also on the board of directors of Catholic Relief Services. It's the second largest humanitarian organization on the planet after the International Red Cross. About $1 billion, 100 countries, 100 million beneficiaries. I'm walking across the rubble of southern Lebanon because, of course, the Israeli Air Force has bombed it back to the Stone Age yet again. And I'm interacting with those who are rebuilding their homes. As you spend time with very proud Lebanese families, almost immediately the conversation goes back to the conflict. And people remember what they didn't have, what they couldn't find for their families. Medical care, water, shelter, food. For me in particular, I remember the stories of the missing children, the lost children during this conflict. And there is a question of who helps these Lebanese families at that time. Who gets them water? Who provides them assistance? Who has the resources and ability to do that? Well, in this part of southern Beirut, it turns out I met him. His name is Khalil. Khalil's about 45, maybe. He's very weathered, so I can't exactly tell his age. He's very jovial. Fast forward a couple of years, this part of southern Beirut is rebuilt. Khalil is still there. He knows everyone's names. He knows everyone's kids' names. He goes to graduations. He goes to funerals. He goes to weddings. He helps people get jobs. So who is Khalil? Who is Khalil? Well, Khalil is the area Hezbollah commander. And when I figure that out, I get it. I get it viscerally. I understand what's going on here. He helps and helps and helps and asks for nothing. But you know, when he needs something now, when he needs to hide his rockets and he needs to hide his men, you think this is about politics? You think he even needs to make a request? No, this is about family. And let me tell you, this is our competition for influence in the human domain. So think about your best soldiers right now. Are any of them on track to have the kind of ties in communities that Khalil has? Because if not, we are already falling behind in the human domain. And that means Special Operations Forces and the broader Army needs to have a very serious conversation around what it's going to take to really compete for influence in the human domain. Now, how do we start that conversation? Well, we're going to start that conversation the way Viva starts all conversations, with facts. I love facts. So, Major Roland, can you give me the first slide? All right. Take a hard look at this. This is the development aid that went to the poorest billion people on the planet since 1960. So add up the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, all of the development aid from the Brits, the Aussies, the Norwegians, the Canadians, and USAID. That is that dark space. If you add it all up, it is $1 trillion. Now, let me show you what we have gotten for that poorest billion people on the planet with this amount of investment. Major Roland, could you give me the next slide? All right. The top line is the economic growth rate of the United States. The red line is the economic growth rate of the poorest billion people on the planet. That's nada. Now, I am an economist and a businesswoman, so numbers speak to me. The way I translate this for my students is that means there's a whole set of grandchildren born now in these places that are worse off than their grandparents were in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, I'm going to give you the highlights of some of the best economic research that goes behind this. So, 3 things. Number 1, of that poorest billion people on the planet, 70% of them currently live in conflict or have in the last 10 years. And the other 30% are like Burundi, who just get the spillovers of conflict. So migration, pressure on the land, food insecurity, disease. That is their human condition. Now, a couple of things you need to know. If you decrease a society's gross domestic product, so you could call that the wealth of a nation. If you decrease that in half, you double the chance of war. If you merely decrease the economic growth rate of a country by 1%, you increase the chance of conflict by 1%. Once again, numbers speak to me. How do I translate that for my students at Notre Dame? The way I translate that for my students, you decrease the gross domestic product of a nation, that's poverty. You decrease the economic growth rate, that's hopelessness. The combination of poverty and hopelessness create many of the conditions that we see for conflict. Now, what has been the world's response? Much of the world's response has really been around empowering women. If you look at the UN's Millennium Development Goals, 3 of 8 of them are all consciously around empowering women. If you look at the success rate of microfinance, in excess of 90% of that goes to women. Why? Because women repay the loans. Excellent. I am all for empowering women. But for this poorest billion people of the planet, my response is enough with the women. I have spent time in Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Congo in this last year. Did I see any Amazons? No, because this is very much around giving young men a stake in peace. To give young men a set of choices other than violent extremism and war and criminality. And what does a stake in peace look like? Looks like a home. Looks like a respected member of a community. Maybe it's getting married. Maybe it's having children. It's certainly having a job, a livelihood. And so where do I get to in terms of the implications for special operations forces? I think there's 2 really big implications. Number 1, USASOC is in the war prevention business. It's in the long-term stabilization business. Special operations forces have come out of the most powerful military on the planet, war-fighting machine in the planet, and the long game now is all around building stability. If you can give the next slide. You don't need me to tell you that. Had to dust off my Sun Tzu in the library to find that quote, but I think you all have lived it. So that's the first implication, and that will be a very big, different change in mindset. You'll have to talk about operations differently and missions differently. And you'll have to think through how success looks differently in this long game. So that's implication number one. Implication number two is that you're going to have to do it through partnerships. Because think about the constraints you face. Even with a persistent presence, you only get 180 days in country. How are you going to compete with Khalil like that? That's very difficult, right? And so you need to think through what kind of partnerships you're going to need. Now, once again, this is going to be a challenge. Why? Because you've come from the most coercive, powerful machine in the planet, and this is going to take empathy. Certainly, building a whole of government approach is extremely important, and building the partnerships across the government. I would argue that it goes even further. It goes to humanitarian organizations and non-governmental organizations and potentially businesses who all have a common stake in peace. Now, once again, this is going to be hard. Major Roland, could I have the next slide? Here's why it's going to be hard. On the left-hand side, look at the budget of AUSA versus General Electric versus Exxon versus the amount that the Gates Foundation gives away every year. That means Bill Gates, through half of his lifetime, has single-handedly created more wealth that he gives away every year than his AUSA budget. Right? Who do I want you guys to start talking to in the embassies? Certainly with all the fellow members of government, but also with potential companies, potential humanitarian organizations, potential foundations, all who you will find common ground with. Now, how would I like to leave you on this? I'm going to leave you with advice from the saints. Major Roland, this is by far the best quote I ever found on partnership. I'll leave you a moment to read it. You will have to see the world for its possibilities. You will have to see what the potential common ground is with different and varied multiple partners, and you will have to take the first steps to create it. And if advice from the saints doesn't work for you, I'm going to give you advice from the dead. You can spend your whole life being the best of the best, or you can just go do something that no one else has ever done. It is a brave new world. Your competition is racing ahead. And the only thing that is important is how the soldiers in this room address these challenges. Thank you very much.